Hello, everybody, and welcome to Men's Health Week. And thanks very much for coming to the Men's Health Forum webinar to join me and Marcus Maloney talking about boys, men, and toxic communities. So just very briefly, before Marcus and I chat, I'm going to tell you a bit about Men's Health Week, obviously, and a very little bit about the Men's Health Forum. I'm guessing most of you all know all about us already. We are the founders of Men's Health Week. I remember sitting in the meeting where we decided to have one, and it's been going for, I don't know, 20 odd years now. The mission of the Men's Health Forum is to improve the health of men and boys. We work in England, Scotland and Wales, and we're the founders, as I just said, of Men's Health Week. These are the sorts of things we do. We do research and policy work. So, for example, the report showing that 1 in 10 men now have diabetes. We share best practice. So, for example, our report on how to make mental health services work for men, which is for people who provide mental health services and are struggling to get men to use them. We work with others, as we did in COVID, and as we are now, obviously, on Men's Health Week. And we provide materials direct to men in the form of the Man Manual, and we do training as well. So this is what Men's Health Week's about this year. Are we spending too much time on our tech? That was the starting point of it, because we realized that the iPhone turns 16 this year. It's growing up, and as a result, any boy or girl turning 16 has been walking around with a high-powered computer in their pocket, and all of us are doing that now. Obviously, lots of advantages to that from a health point of view, but quite a few downsides as well, which is obviously part of what we're going to be talking about. So in terms of Men's Health Week, there's a whole load of social media stuff that you can share. Smartphone, stupid o'clock, are you spending too much time on your phone? You can also talk about your favorite platform if you want. There's Twitter there, but we've got stuff for all of the main platforms, social media shares and posters and stuff that you can stick up in your workplace. We've got a toolbox talk if you want to get a conversation going in your workplace about whether we're spending too much time on tech. It's got a quiz, all sorts of interesting talking points and sort of key info about phone use and some of the problems that it can cause. And particularly, we're looking at it from the forum's point of view, 2 problems which particularly affect men and which have been fueled, I think it's fair to say, exponentially by the availability of 24/7 internet. So we produced a manual about pornography called Porn Free. It is pretty clear from the research that I've been looking in whilst we've been putting this together that there's a problem there bigger than perhaps many of us realise. And it is, in fact, now the second most common cause for men seeking help with addiction, second only to alcohol. So there's a new manual on pornography. It's free PDF during the week, but you can also buy hard copies. And similarly, we've got one on gambling, another addiction that's been seriously fueled by 24/7 internet, called Wanna Bet. You know, obviously, because you're tuning into the forum event, that 3/4 of suicides in this country are male, and the charity Gambling for Lives estimate that about 600 gambling-related suicides in the UK every year. So obviously a vast proportion of them are going to be men. So both of those manuals I would recommend having a look at. Both of them are free PDFs during the week. And there's a couple of events. One we're at already, the Men and Online Harms event with Marcus, and also I'm interviewing Dr Hilary Jones at the Royal Voluntary Services Virtual Village on Thursday, if you want to come to that. So that's Men's Health Week and a brief introduction to the Men's Health Forum. You can see the link on the screen, which will find you everything that you need. I'm now going to introduce Marcus Maloney, and we're going to talk a little bit about boys, men and toxic communities. So Marcus is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Coventry University in the Centre for Post-Digital Cultures. His research focuses on men and masculinities online, ideological contestations and culture wars in digital spaces, video game narratives, cultures and communities, and post-digital intimacies and socialities. Marcus has published widely in these areas, including articles in cultural sociology, new media and society, and games and culture. His most recent book is Gender, Masculinity and Video Gaming, Analysing Reddit's R-Gaming Community, which was published by Palgrove Macmillan in 2019. So I'm going to hand over to Marcus. He's going to tell you a little bit about the work that he's been doing, which kind of brought us together, which is the reason why we're here today talking about this. Marcus.
Okay, well, I'll just, if you give me a second, I'll share. Okay, it gives me the option to stop your share. So hold on a second. Oh, here we go. So
thanks, Marcus. Seems to be working.
Yay. All right. Thank you for the intro. It's a genuine honor, I guess, to be able to speak to Men's Health Forum, and it's really nice to see people sort of engage with this. Yeah, so, I mean, Jim's given you a bit of a summary of my research. I mean, principally, what I've been looking at over the last sort of few years is, sort of boys, men, and of course, notions of masculinity online. My key focus, and this is kind of what we're talking about today, and it's contentious stuff, and I, genuinely sort of inviting sort of debate on these issues. But, I've been really interested in a lot of the sort of online spaces that are viewed as being problematic or, toxic. And we're putting toxic in quote marks because I think there is scope for sort of critically, unpacking that concept. So, I mean, my earlier stuff was looking at sort of video gaming communities, which are sort of dominated by sort of young boys and young men. And this idea that they're sort of, kind of exclusionary, that, they're sort of unwelcoming to women and so on. But then I've sort of broadened out into other sort of problematic spaces, things, like, for example, the Andrew Tate thing is a sort of big example of a sort of a community that is sort of like coalesced around that particular guy. My main actual, modest as it might be, but my main sort of contribution to this kind of area of research has been to uncover what I see as being, the real sort of complexity of these spaces. It's not all just sort of blanket sort of toxic or reactionary sort of discourse. I mean, the way that I would sort of describe a lot of these spaces is kind of contested or divided, which of course, surprise, surprise, is kind of the characteristic of broader society right now as well. And then, of course, over the last couple of years, I've been increasingly interested in what's drawing young men into these spaces that are sort of deemed as being toxic. To give you a quick, one of the recent papers I looked at, one of the recent papers I published with some colleagues was looking at this very, very notorious platform called 4chan, which is, sort of for a long time, it's been seen as a kind of breeding ground for kind of far-right, misogynistic sort of communities and discourse. What we actually found, though, when we looked at this space was a lot of the sort of young guys that are going into these spaces don't actually start off sort of with that particular kind of worldview. They're not sort of exhibiting what some would refer to as sort of toxic attitudes. And essentially what you're seeing is a lot of kind of vulnerable, sort of lost young guys who are kind of being drawn into these kind of, I guess you could say, radicalizing spaces, but they're going in there simply in search of a sense of kind of belonging and community, and also, a sense of being able to kind of express themselves without being judged, which is, of course, how a lot of them feel in terms of their engagement with more mainstream society. But anyway, I mean, I'm going to talk a bit, and I'll try and get over this as soon as possible because I'm more interested in kind of talking to Jim and, and sort of everyone. But I mean, so Jim asked me to sort of talk about this report that, Jim was sort of wonderful enough to be involved in. And the catalyst for this report was, has been the government's online safety bill. I should say, by the way, I built this report with a team of researchers in the Centre for Post-Digital Cultures, each of us looking at different aspects of sort of online safety. So Lindsay Balfour and Adrian Evans are sort of researchers looking at women's experiences and treatment online, issues of harassment and abuse and so on, also sort of revenge porn, things like that. Sarah Kate Mary and her focus on, sort of disabled and neurodiverse people's experiences. And then, of course, my focus on boys and men online, and especially sort of heterosexual boys and men. But But anyway, so the catalyst for all this is the online safety bill, which should, I think, probably pass at some point this year. Baroness Nikki Morgan was good enough to write the foreword to our report, and I think her words sort of capture the kind of tension of this bill really well, in the sense, as she says at least, one at the same time, it is absolutely a world-leading piece of legislation. There's very little like it in sort of other countries at the moment. But then also, I mean, and partly this is just because we're talking about such a big issue, it's also sort of insufficient in how it sort of aims to deal with kind of notions of kind of online harm. To sort of give you a quick summary, I mean, the gaps in terms of what the bill does, I think, are pretty clear to everyone at this point. So, I mean, across kind of numerous, I don't know how many kind of iterations and, sort of rewrites and so on, and of course, numerous at this point governments as well. The bill has essentially been reduced down to one that primarily focuses on protecting children from age-inappropriate content, which of course is important, and then all users from illegal content. So the thing is, I mean, many of the kind of issues of kind of online harm, like, for example, the ones that sort of Jim and the Men's Health Forum, you guys are sort of interested in, and then things that I'm interested in and my fellow researchers are, a lot of these things actually fall beyond the boundaries of illegal and then into this much kind of more contentious or sort of grayer territory of sort of harmful but legal. I'm doing this a lot, I just realized, but there we go. And of course, the bill is primarily focused on giving responsibility to social media platforms to moderate content that goes there. And a lot of these sort of issues of online harm, I think, and our sort of report goes into this, sort of fall beyond just, kind of moderating bad content online. It's actually not necessary to be super critical of the bill, which, for us and a lot of people does represent a really important starting point. But I guess, that's just it. It's, it's a starting point, and it really does need to kind of elicit a lot, sort of wider and kind of ongoing discussion, basically about trying to ensure, within reason, trying to ensure that these, hugely integral technologies, elicit, good outcomes rather than bad outcomes. And yeah, in this report that I'm sort of sharing today, sort of aims to contribute to this. And Jim, hopefully you were able to put that link to the report in the chat.
Put the link in the chat.
I knew I'd have to remind you. All right. Anyway, okay. Anyway, so what do we do? And Jim was involved in this. And again, I think I've thanked him about 1 million times at this point, but just one more thanks to Jim for your involvement. Basically, we conducted 4 workshops, me and my colleagues, related to our different research areas. And we invited stakeholders and practitioners to kind of basically just enter into a sort of discussion with us. And basically for us as academics to kind of get a sense of, practitioners' experiences and understandings of this issue on the ground. So yeah, the principal focus of my workshop was, as we've been saying, the rise of what's referred to as toxic ideologies online. And this is, particularly true with sort of hetero boys and young men. I guess more specifically, again, the question is, what's driving this cohort in these directions, and what can, or even, what should be done about it? I think at this point, it's probably important for me to define this notion of toxic, and I so as I say in the report itself, I mean, essentially what we're talking about here are ideologies that espouse sort of far right, sort of reactionary, and as someone who's looked at a wide range of sort of data online and so on, I think it's fair to say outright violent and misogynistic worldviews. Very importantly, and I know Jim agrees with this, these are worldviews that are not just sort of harmful to the girls and women who are exposed to them, but they're also harmful to the boys and young men who are being drawn into them. And I think, again, the big sort of famous example of that right now is sort of this immense popularity of Andrew Tate. And I guess the workshop that I did with Jim and others, just quick shout out to Ruth Pott, the Wellbeing Coordinator at Band Construction, Marcus Hercombe, Corey Sills at a great youth organisation, Sheffield Chili Pep, And last but certainly not least, Tim Allard at Men's Craft, who joined me for the session. But our workshop was unique, and I guess kind of uniquely difficult in a sense, in that, we are discussing our cohort as both potential victims and both potential perpetrators of online harm. And as we're sort of going to go into, I think there's a big grey area in between those two things of sort of victim and perpetrator. And yeah, I mean, just to stress this, I mean, the opportunity, and I see today as sort of continuing that, the opportunity to kind of actually connect with practitioners and stuff, it's just been, super illuminating for me. But anyway, I mean, in terms of, that kind of principal focus that we're talking about today, there was really one very dominant theme that sort of we all kept circling back to. And that was that the rise of this, these sort of toxic ideologies. First and foremost, this is a social and a cultural issue. It's not, or at least it's not just a technological one. And the most effective kind of interventions into trying to sort of improve outcomes for boys and young men are going to be found in this kind of broader sphere of culture and society, rather than just focusing on this sort of end product online. I mean, to put it another way, I mean, focusing on kind of moderating content online, which of course is what the Online Safety Bill aims to do, successfully or not successfully, however you want to look at it. This is essentially only dealing with the end stage symptoms of what's, really a sort of a deeper and broader issue of how boys and young men are being socialized into society and how they're kind of finding meaning and identity. I think it's fair to say, this increasing climate of uncertainty, precariousness in a whole range of different ways, material and sort of, existential, and so on. So yes, I'm nearly over with my bit. So we were able to kind of think through what, kind of next steps might broadly look like in terms of how society and how governments and so on might sort of grapple with this issue. And as it shows here, these were as follows. So number one, and this is important to me, government needs to invest more in digital media literacy, which is teaching people the kind of intellectual tools to be able to kind of make informed choices about content and so on. And I think at this stage of the game in the 21st century, this should be seen as a fundamental component of the British education system. Number two, preventative and rehabilitative approaches need to be applied to this issue. Not just calling out and sort of demonizing or whatever. And yeah, very importantly, and this is sort of what we're focusing on, all of this needs to be underpinned by an understanding that at the end of the day, vulnerability lies at the heart of this issue. It's really the common denominator. And essentially, guys like Andrew Tate are just sort of capitalizing on this vulnerability and doing it very successfully, I might add. Sort of related to that, I should say, there is a legitimate sense that the mainstream conversation on these issues can veer unhelpfully into demonizing sort of individual boys and men, and also kind of demonizing, sort of men's practices as a whole. And what we talked about was, this only serves to further disenfranchise and, of course, then send into the arms of figures like Tate. Having said that, we also have to deal with on, one side of this debate, often there's a lot of misrepresentation, some of it deliberate, I think, of the arguments that people like me are trying to make. But we can go into this further. Number three, government needs to much better consult with organisations like yourself, men's health organisations, and also youth organisations, basically in building any sort of response to this issue. And then also, I think, provide opportunities for collaboration between organisations who might not sort of know how to do that. And very importantly, opportunities for organisations like you guys to be able to coordinate or to at least talk with the tech industry. And then finally, number four, and I know this is important to Jim, in terms of thinking about the technological side, there does need to be a much more critical interrogation of how, not just apps, but the hardware itself, as Jim was sort of saying earlier, sort of designed to kind of elicit this ceaseless engagement from users that's essentially antithetical to, mental well-being more generally, and then, also antithetical, I think, to the kind of positive social outcomes that, for example, like the one that we're looking at today. So I will now unshare my slides, and that's my little spiel. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thanks very much, Marcus. So I think, from what I understand, the chat's now working, so feel free to use that. And we also have the Q&A. So ask any questions you want in the Q&A. I'll try and feed them into Marcus in the course of our chat. So Marcus, it's really interesting. I think the key point, kind of lots of points out what you said, but the fact that all these guys who may become predatory at some point start off as vulnerable young boys, often on the internet, who don't really know where to go. Can you say a bit more about how these sort of platforms of 4chan or Andrew Tate or whatever, how do they take someone who is vulnerable like that, and I suppose, how do they groom them is what I'm asking.
Yeah, well, God, I mean, I'd be a bit apprehensive about using a word like groom. I guess I'm also apprehensive about using a word like indoctrination. I mean, like a lot of internet phenomena, just to kind of preface this, I mean, like a lot of internet phenomena, whether it's, what was that old activist group? They're still sort of going, I can't remember the name, but a lot of internet sort of phenomena is quite disorganized. So that there's not a sort of, they're not clear lines between, leaders and followers. They're not sort of, there's no sort of formal structure to these things. I mean, to go back to that 4chan paper that I did, that was published last year in New Media and Society, if anyone's interested. So that was a very big data study. So we looked at sort of a month's worth of commentary on this sort of very, populated space in terms of the sort of, I don't know how many comments, sort of hundreds of thousands or whatever it was. The paper's not in front of me. And, you could actually see that process in action where the board that we were looking at was called the /advice board. And it was, primarily it was young, vulnerable guys who sort of were, self-perceiving as kind of failures in terms of the kind of sexual marketplace. They saw themselves as failures in terms of, sort of attaining, meaningful work. All of those things that are, realities of 2023, Western societies. And so they would go into these platforms and they would say, just can someone help me with these things? And to be fair, there was a pattern of responses that were really supportive, and sort of, positive, I think. But there were also a pattern of responses where users would very overtly try to get them to reframe their problems as that they were essentially, this is not me sort of putting words into anyone's mouth. They were essentially victims of a society that was now run by feminists who wanted to make their lives worse. And so yes, you saw that. You also saw again, I use the term indoctrination advisedly, but guys were going on there for sort of help on how they could be more appealing to women, and and they would get responses like, I'll just man up, stop whinging, go get a hooker in Thailand, things like that. So there was a range of kind of patterns of responses that, guys would sort of get in these spaces, that fall into that category. I mean, the other thing is I watch a lot of sort of kind of culture wars, both left and right, kind of culture wars stuff on YouTube and so on. And it's all very kind of like explicitly there to make the case for a particular worldview. And one interesting sort of aspect of that in terms of thinking about gateways towards any ideology, whether it's a good ideology or a bad ideology or whatever, is sort of secondary. But one thing that's really interesting is the way that popular culture is used as a sort of a way of drawing people into particular, more broader social arguments. So there are a lot of these guys on, say, YouTube who, and this is where it's interesting, they make, some arguably quite legitimate critiques of, say, Disney and their sort of corporate sort of diversity attempts, and how, some people, and I know people from, various sort of, different ethnic backgrounds, some would agree with this, can be quite sort of cynical in how they sort of kind of, use diversity essentially to make money. And so I think a lot of these sort of guys are kind of drawing, just to give one specific example, will draw someone in, you know, in the kind of realm of popular culture, and then that kind of mutates into a sort of broader argument about that essentially, and again, I'm not sort of overstating this in terms of some of the rhetoric that's out there, that essentially society has succumbed to a feminist plot to destroy men.
So is there a danger then that you're talking about the online harms bill, that because it sort of just focuses on sort of the easy stuff, that it pushes men even further into, or young men even more into sort of those sorts of communities?
Well, no, I mean, I don't think, you know, for whatever its strengths and weaknesses, I mean, I think once the online safety bill's enacted, again, it's very limited, which, depending on where you sit in terms of free speech, is a good or a bad thing. But you know, when it's enacted, it's going to do very little in terms of trying to sort of grapple with the content that you know, that we're talking about. You know, and as I've spoken to you in previous contexts, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if deplatforming or taking content offline is really the solution. And you could sort of see it as the kind of proverbial band-aid solution, because it kind of takes it out of sight and out of mind. But if you conceive of this issue as a broader social issue in the way that I've been talking about and we're talking about, then you're really, it's kind of a whack-a-mole approach. You're just sort of taking out the sort of end stage sort of expressions of this thing.
Yeah. Thanks very much, everybody who's putting questions in. Some of them are quite long preambles stating your views on it, which is interesting, but quite difficult for me to read whilst I'm also listening to Marcus. So try and keep the questions short if you can. That would be a bit easier for me. Marcus, you put the word toxic in inverted commas. Do you think that word itself has become toxic?
Okay, here we go. Well, it's certainly, in terms of public discourse, it's become a cliche. I mean, to some extent, this is the inevitable. I'm not a linguist, but to some extent, it's the inevitable process of what happens to at one point useful terms, and then they sort of get simplified, reduced, and thrown around in a range of different ways. I should point out that it's not often known. People tend to sort of think that the term and the concept is one from feminist thought, but it's actually one from the earlier men's rights movements, I think in the 1970s. And there was a really interesting sort of, which you guys would probably know more about than me. There was a really interesting sort of breakup of that original group, basically along sort of progressive / conservative lines, I guess. I should say, and I mean, if you don't mind me saying it, I mean, this was kind of demonstrated, I think, in the kind of the Twitter response to the promo for this session that we're having. There is a lot of, real misrepresentation, and I think some of it, at least, deliberate misrepresentation and what you call kind of straw manning of what people like me are trying to say. Broadly. So there's a straw manning that, I'm sitting here trying to say all men are toxic, or I'm sitting here trying to say that masculinity as a thing is toxic. And of course, that's not the case. And I very much hope that that's clear in terms of what I'm saying. So, yeah, I mean, the term itself starts out quite useful. Obviously, well, not obviously, but it's a way simply of highlighting, and this is open to debate, but it's a way of highlighting how some sort of traditional, or what you could call sort of orthodox ideals of manhood can become quite unhealthy, especially when taken to certain extremes. So, classic example of that, of course, is sort of the kind of suppression of emotions that a lot of us men, through our lives are sort of sort of encouraged to sort of engage in. And I mean, I don't want to sort of trigger warning, and I don't want this to become too much of a grim conversation, but if, the rate of male suicide has been high before, the civil rights movement, before feminism and after feminism. So I think you can safely say there's no causal effect there. And I think, there's mountains of research which demonstrate quite clearly the link to that and the pressures that men face in trying to achieve an ideal that is just simply unattainable. But then, of course, sort of highlighting that there are patterns, and this is not to say it's with everyone, but there are patterns that are worth investigating of men and, sort of exhibiting sort of misogynistic sort of attitudes towards women. So, yeah, I mean, the phenomenon that term tries to make sense of are very real. They're of concern. I mean, if you don't think that the huge popularity of Andrew Tate is an issue, then I'm not sure where we can go from that in terms of debating. And also, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but also, you only have to speak to your average single heterosexual woman trying to navigate the world of dating apps to get a sense of what they think sort of marks masculinity. So I think there's a sense of, we need to kind of try and, sort of live in other people's shoes on this as well. But to critique sorry, I will get to the end of my answer, but to critique the term, in an academic sense, I find it interesting. It's one of these kind of curiously kind of biological or kind of medical metaphors that essentially kind of divests or takes responsibility or agency away from individuals. It's as if there's, it sort of kind of flips into a kind of a sense that there's an actual real disease spreading around. And of course, when it's applied to individual boys and men as being toxic, there's a compulsion that we must sort of exile or banish them because of the way that kind of metaphor works. And of course, that's just, that's not helpful to anyone. The last thing I'll say on this, to sort of concede a bit of territory, I think, is that, I think it is too widely used to describe, a broader range of, say, sort of conservative views that, maybe I wouldn't agree with, but nonetheless, I think very much have their place in public discourse. And in that sense, there's a difference between Andrew Tate and, I don't know, someone like Peter Hitchens and so on. So I think at the very least, this is something that needs to be carefully circumscribed, and to be fair, not always is. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that's really interesting, Marcus. I mean, the fact that masculinity is so often prefaced with the word toxic, I mean, is it even now no longer useful really to talk about masculinity? This idea that we have of it is very old-fashioned, something that might have been, to be strong and silent and always be in charge or whatever, very, very handy, if you're fighting a saber-toothed tiger or whatever, but maybe not so useful now. And the problem is we haven't got a kind of, I don't want to say new man, but a more modern definition of masculinity to actually talk about. Maybe we don't need one.
Well, I mean, I guess the issue is that, there's so much contestation and debate about what is a good man now, and those debates, like so much of discussion in 2023, just suddenly fall into these sort of right versus left ideological lines. I mean, the saber-toothed tiger one I always find interesting. I should say to you and everyone, I am not an expert on Neolithic gender relations. But I do find, as someone, who's like probably a lot of us, had, countless sort of, good faith arguments, as it were, in pubs with other guys, there's that whole sort of like, well, back in hunter-gatherer societies, such and such, or in caveman times, such and such. And those kinds of arguments do tend to get sort of employed in order to kind of, reinforce, a kind of a traditionalist view of, kind of men's and women's kind of natural position in society. In terms of, I think in terms of the broader question, the fact is that, we live, in this huge state of kind of social flux on a whole range of issues, and gender being, a really prominent one. And, just again, this kind of contestation about what it means to be a good man and how that sort of runs across sort of ideological lines. And and one of the products, sort of unfortunate products of this is how boys and young men sort of experience that social contestation in the here and now. In that, and this came through with talking, and it always comes through talking to sort of practitioners, and also, the kind of undergraduate students, 18-year-old guys that I sort of teach and so on. There's a deep sense of confusion about, how to sort of operate in the world. And so in a sense, it's going to be inevitable that a lot of these guys are going to be attracted to figures like Tate, who offer them, as grim as it might seem to some of us, that they offer a simple sort of Manichaean, which is to say sort of simple good versus evil view of the world and of their problem.
Which is, I mean, is the problem with online generally, isn't it? That this kind of binary divide there.
Sorry, yeah, just quickly on that. I mean, that's interesting, and that goes to your sort of what your sort of concern is as well, is that the algorithms. I mean, no one knows exactly how, say, Twitter's algorithm works or whatever. These are all kind of proprietary things, but we know enough to know that the algorithm preferences divisive content because it keeps people engaged. So yeah, there is absolutely a technological side. I mean, as a sociologist, I'm always focusing on the broader social stuff, but it's always talking to guys like you that I have to remember that there is a sort of accelerating effect going on in terms of how the internet and how these apps are actually designed.
Maybe a bit of a curveball, Marcus, because someone's asked.
Oh God!
Someone's asked it on the Q&A. But I mean,
I don't even dare look at the comments. But anyway,
how would you define a good man? I mean, I suppose I'm asking you to give a sort of better definition of masculinity, one that won't have the word toxic in front of it.
I mean, I am an insufferable relativist to some extent. I think there are, I think it. I mean, in terms of the issues we're looking at, it's a good man is someone, first and foremost, if we're talking about gender, or even race or whatever, someone who's respectful and empathetic with others, and with women, people who are different to you or whatever. And I don't see any contradiction in that. I mean, I watch a lot of action films. I play violent video games, and there's I'm not going to sort of sit here and sort of turn into sort of some kind of like hyper woke moralizing guy or whatever. But I just think there are certain fundamental principles of decency that I get, and also understanding of people who are different to you, including women. And again, that's why I sort of mentioned before that, and it's easy for me as a kind of a hetero white guy to walk through the world and go, what are you talking about? The world's a wonderful place. Everyone's tolerant or whatever. And the fact is, again, all I do is sort of speak to my sort of female friends navigating dating apps, and their view of the world will be very different. I mean, I realize that answer is probably quite banal, but
I quite like empathetic and respectful. Sounds like a pretty good starting point, to be honest. I think that would be very helpful.
But I should just to quickly add to that, and I mean, I think that empathy extends to trying to understand the anger and the insecurity that are felt by it. I remember when I was 22, I was a complete basket case, and certain things happened over my life that I see sort of saving me in quite a lot of literal ways. And so I have a lot of empathy, across the board, I guess. So I try to.
I think that's what it kind of, in a sense, how I kind of see empathy is. It's not something that you kind of ration. It is across the board.
Exactly.
I mean,
and especially with the more difficult, especially with things that seem more horrifying, or we don't understand. I mean, that's when that needs to really kick in. Sorry, go on.
Absolutely, no, I agree. You mentioned your work on video games, and a generation ago, video games were going to destroy everything. There's too violent. We're all going to become completely mad. In the 50s, Elvis Presley was going to destroy civilization. Where does this current sort of debate about toxic masculinity and online harms, where does that rank in the sort of league of moral panics? Maybe it isn't a panic.
Yeah, this is another very hedge bet academic answer, but I think it's quite simply, I think, I mean, I wouldn't be sitting here to you if I didn't think that these were legitimately concerning issues. But the way that they sort of take on a life of their own in sort of the public forum does bear striking resemblances to sort of earlier sort of moral panics. And yeah, video games are an interesting one because, I actually found this in my research on kind of guys in the video gaming communities, and they're sort of seen as exclusionary and sort of hateful or whatever. But you really need to understand the history of how young sort of male gamers have been treated since the 1980s to sort of get a bit of broader context on that. So they're very defensive and not unjustifiably so, because they have for decades been the focus of moral panics around, being violent, being antisocial. I mean, this goes right back to the sort of late 70s and the sort of pinball arcades and the arcades that were these sort of dens of sin, drug dealing and so on. Then, of course, it shifts into, as gaming shifts more into the home, that moral panic becomes much more sort of psychological. And then, of course, now you've got people like me highlighting these kinds of problematic gender attitudes there. And so I totally understand, the average gamer going, just feeling sort of overwhelmed by this sort of, kind of ongoing sort of decades-long attack on their hobby pastime. When most people enjoy the pastime, and as we found in our studies of these spaces, there is as much sort of positive, progressive sort of discourse, and as well as conservative, and all colours of the rainbow there.
Thanks, Mark. So I've got a couple of more things, but it's just something I want to go back to talking about the online harms bill before I kind of come back to some of the questions that I've lined up. Someone's saying there's a very active campaign led by some women's charities to have a violence against women and girls code of conduct included in the online safety bill. Do you agree it should be a code that includes men and boys too? Otherwise, it risks further marginalisation.
Yeah, I mean, so my colleagues, other sections of the report talk about this, and also recommend this in some form, and just these are difficult issues, but so I mean this is kind of part of a broader thing of when researchers or activists or whatever argue for VAWG, they're doing so from the position where girls and women are predominantly the victims of this stuff, and so it does get. I mean, it's like there's broader issues, and I must say that I'm sort of starting to kind of like drift out of my sort of research area in terms of some of these issues,
Sure.
but it's a tricky one, because if we look at sexual violence in society, it's predominantly experienced by girls and women. So again, trying to see it from another perspective, it's justifiable that people would want to kind of intervene through that in that way, in the sense that gender is part of this. I mean, but we do need to do that in a way which doesn't just render invisible, the men who experience this as well. Just to give you a quick sort of historical issue, because I mean, it does need to be understood how gender relates to these issues. It was only the 1990s that, say, for example, in the UK, marriage within rape, rape within marriage was sort of it became a crime. And of course, underpinning the idea of this horrific sort of act is the idea of women as property, which of course is linked. Well, I mean, you could say hyper, but it's linked to sort of age-old sort of kind of gender sort of norms. And that's a really horrifying example. But some of the stuff that we're talking about today, and particularly if you look at the discourse of people like Andrew Tate, their rhetoric comes from exactly the same place as those horrific acts that have now been made illegal for decades or whatever. That all comes from that same place. So I think we do need to understand that, yes, it's not just women and girls who might experience this, but they predominate in this, and also there's very much a gendered sort of logic to those acts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it does, Marcus. I mean, Andrew Tate's name's come up quite a bit, so it seems sort of appropriate to sort of ask something about role models. And I suppose, do we need people as role models for men who are not just interested in clicks? because sometimes you wonder whether these people even actually believe what they're saying. They just think it's going to get them clicks because, as you say, the technology is preferential to anything that's abusive.
Yeah, so can you kind of simplify the question a little bit? I mean, it's about do we need role models beyond the kind of social media influences? I guess is that sort of the question? Yeah, that's really interesting one as well. I mean, well, I was about to say my preference, but my focus, I guess, is on broader society and what it offers sort of boys and young men. In terms of kind of meaningful, sort of healthy and secure identities. And I guess sort of, role models are a key part of that, I guess. But again, just to kind of echo what I was saying before, these are the old certainties as a whole, kind of cultural certainties and kind of material certainties are becoming much more kind of difficult to attain for many, not just sort of young men, but also women as well. And by that, so, role models, I think, are an expression of this. But what we're talking about is, changes to culture and, more importantly, the economy. It's more difficult to attain, secure employment. It's more difficult to it's more difficult to buy a home, particularly for working class people. Meaningful sort of long-term relationships are more difficult to sort of like maintain. And then, of course, in terms of our focus, compounding this is with young men, it's sort of two interrelated things. And there's a number of very big studies, for example, that show quite clearly that young men now are much more likely to be experiencing loneliness and isolation. And then compounding that is they're much less likely to try and reach out to sort of for help in terms of that kind of vulnerability or whatever. So anyway, but there's some interesting research in terms of the position. In terms of the position of social media influencers, whether it's female ones, fitness, beauty ones, or Andrew Tate or whatever. And it's I can't remember the paper, but by the way, if anyone's interested in this, I'm not difficult to find online. I would be happy to provide a reading list of all the things I've sort of brought up here. But there's a great paper I read, which rang really true to me, which was that social media influences and that whole culture, in a sense, kind of is a little bit like a sort of a pyramid scheme in terms of how it operates. But social media influence, if your life, if you're a young person today and the prospect of finding a meaningful, secure job is as realistic as what a social media influencer is suggesting you can get if you become like them. And when we provide those technological tools to engage in that culture, but we don't provide the tools for a lot of young people to actually get these secure jobs, it's almost sort of logical that they would be drawn into and attracted by that lifestyle. So, I mean, a lot of the sort of commentary on that is sort of, this kind of, young people are so nihilistic and obsessed with their phones. And it's like, well, maybe they can only afford a mobile phone as the most expensive item in their life. And maybe a life of a social media influencer is as realistic to them as, a good, well-paid, secure job.
So, I mean, see, it's really interesting. So if you're saying that to some extent, this is fueled by the fact that the employment is poor, the chance of getting a good job is slim. Certainly the chance of getting a good, secure job is very, very slim. Housing is really difficult to get hold of. Young people are quite isolated, they're quite lonely. It sounds like this is less of a problem with the internet, and it's just another crisis in capitalism.
Yeah, well, God, I don't know if we want to subject everyone to our sort of covert Marxist roots or whatever. No. But I was thinking about the response that I was about to give. But I mean, capitalism is defined by crises. I mean, there's a famous old Marx quote. I can't remember the longer one, but all that is solid melts into air. And what he was referring to with that was that I mean, you can essentially live in any decade of this thing we call capitalist modernity, and there's some or other sort of crisis, and the certainties and the ways of being that we once took for granted 20 years ago are now sort of gone, and that will continue to be the case. But yeah, and I mean, I just to sort of kind of reinforce, I mean, we can look at the different components, whether it's home ownership or whatever, but what we're talking about is that life that, even sort of working class people sort of enjoyed coming out of in the sort of post-war period is now increasingly, lost. And maybe we're at a time where we're reconfiguring what that needs to be, or maybe there does need to be more pushback. And again, I don't want to get too into sort of areas that aren't my thing, but I would be very supportive. Let's just say I would be very supportive of people in the realm of academia and politics or whatever who see the increasing proliferation of, say, 0-hour contracts and things like that as an issue. I mean, some economic genius in the 1980s realized that this stuff was going to be a good thing for driving profit. But, it has all sorts of weird, sort of cultural impacts that I think we're sort of seeing now, especially, in the wake of the GFC, which I know hit the UK really hard and still sort of informs where people are at on a whole range of issues, whether they realize it or not. God, we've really kind of gone big at this point. But
we weren't expecting to get into crises of capitalism, I guess.
Yeah.
So just to bring it back a little bit more to the work that the Men's Health Forum's doing, this is a very interesting question from Jason on the in the Q&A, which you will relate to, Marcus, as an Australian. He says, Australia has two different health policies for women and girls and men and boys. They have recognised we have different needs. Do you think and feel this would help having male health have a voice, which would also help women and girls?
God, I mean, this might be related to reforms that have sort of been going on in Australia since I left. So I was there in like 2018. I'm not, I don't, that's really interesting to me. I don't, yeah, I mean, like, it's like with the issue with the question we were talking about before, I don't see a problem with intervening on issues along sort of lines of social factors, because and so long as as the person who's asked the question has suggested, so long as everyone is sort of brought into this conversation and sort of everyone's sort of needs are addressed in policy, it's not a zero-sum game. So I mean, I guess I would agree in principle with the idea, but I don't know the actual Australian health policies as they stand right now.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Well, the forum's campaigning for a men's health strategy here in the UK. There has already been a women's health one promised. Well,
I would absolutely support that, and especially after having sort of met and sort of engaged with you and the forum.
Marcus, is there anything I haven't asked you and given you the opportunity to talk about? We've got about 5 minutes left. Any other points that you kind of wanted to make on this topic?
No, if you want to throw another interesting question from the chat or the Q&A, and also, I mean, afterwards, if you could send me the actual, because I haven't been looking at it because I was just sort of freaking out about it a bit, but I'd love to see it. But yeah, I encourage, again, I've got a staff profile and stuff. I encourage people, if they, if they're interested in sort of, especially if they're practitioners and so on listening, I'm really interested in knowledge sharing as well. But yes, if you've got another question or two to throw out,
we'll make sure that this is widely shared. And yeah, I mean, the questions in the chat, it's not quite what we might have expected after the Twitter pile-off that we had. So that's good.
That was interesting. I'm going to write a paper about that. But
with 5 minutes left, I'm going to bring Martin Todd, the Chief Executive of the Men's Health Forum, off mute if you're there, Martin, because I saw there was a couple of questions that were asked in the Q&A that you wanted to say something about.
No, I was just clicking the ones that you were answering, so they disappeared from the list. But
right, I thought there are
a lot of interesting questions here and some interesting disputed views. I mean, there was the suggestion of a rite of passage, and then somebody else responding to say, well, hang on, isn't a rite of passage just putting another layer of expectation on men that will probably be out of date by the time we define whatever the rite of passage is? But I think it raises a really interesting question. There is this void which is being filled where some young men are navigating that transition from boyhood to manhood. You know, that is the vulnerable, a time where some have shown vulnerability and ended up, you know, engaging with some of the communities that you've talked about. Is there anything positive that could be done? Are there examples out there of where people are managing that transition better, or is it just something that should be handled via education and a kind of empowerment-based model rather than a exam-based model? I'm not sure that's quite what meant by rite of passage. I don't think I'm doing much justice to Jason's point there, and maybe we need to bring him to ask a question to add his perspective. I don't know if Jason's here. Shall we just, because he raised the idea, but there is, you know, we keep coming back to this. How do we help people?
How do we help people navigate the journey?
How do we help people mature almost?
Yeah.
I think Jason's up.
Jason's up.
Here.
Go on, Jason.
Hi guys. Yeah, well, I've been involved in rites of passage across the planet for about 12 years now, and we've done rites of passage for men from 18 to 90. And I can tell you that we're not doing a rites of passage saying you should be men like this, that, or whatever, and laying down those rules. It's rather about a group of men who are coming together and creating a safe space where men can bring their trauma and their pain out into the open and speak about it in a group of well-grounded men who understand this and have been through this themselves. So what I see in Western culture, and being a youth worker for 15 years in Scotland and now running the Scottish Men's Sheds movement, my hope was through the Men's Shed movement that maybe we would be able to find elders, older men, in a kind environment like a Men's Shed does, which brings compassion rather than competition and violence. And that through these older men who are not sitting at home alone, we might be able to draw upon a healthier model of a rites of passage for our younger teenage boys.
So it's something around mentoring there, is it, Jason? Doesn't say, when I think of a rite of passage, I think people out walking in the wilderness in the Australian bush or something, and that's obviously not quite what you're talking about.
Well, Indigenous cultures across the world have different models. Obviously, we would have had a rite of passage of when you became in Britain or in Europe anyway. When you became a blue-collar worker, whatever, you would be mentored into a trade by another man and wouldn't be your father. And so you would behave very differently. The father-son dynamic is pretty dangerous most of the time. So you need another man to be there in a safe place. And our culture, unfortunately, with the Industrial Revolution, has broken up the village culture. So we're moving away from the home. And now in the 21st century, we have such a high divorce rate. Many mothers would come to me and say, I'm a mom who's trying to bring up a teenage boy whose chemical structure is going through the roof, and I can't be mom and dad. Are there any healthy male role models who he can push against in a safe way? Because I can't be both, and I think I'm losing my son.
What do you say to that, Jason? That's a tough question.
It's a tough question, and it's unanswerable. The thing would be, yes, you're absolutely right, Mum. We need to get healthy male role models, and I can say that in England, there's the Journeyman group who are initiating boys, and we're trying to get it up here in Scotland. In America, it's called Boys to Men, which is huge now, and actually going into the schools. And the schools, particularly the gang warfare, these are older men who are coming in and supporting our youngsters. But the difference between adult initiation and boy initiation in this way is that the men seem to have to commit to like 2 years to be in that boy's life. That's a hell of a commitment to give to a group of boys. And, you know, we're the men. And if we're self-isolating, which we tend to do more than women, this is one of the reasons I wanted to start the Men's Shed movement, was to be able to access these older men, because they're sitting at home literally waiting to die. And the culture has to change. We can't find them. But through the Men's Shed movement, we're actually finding these guys now, which is for a younger man, even at 59 now, and for the guys in their 30s, it's proving incredibly healthy and helpful.
That's really interesting, Jason. Thanks very much for sharing that. Marcus, you got any thoughts on rites of passage?
Oh, yeah, I mean, a lot, but I just wanted to also say, I can imagine for all people involved in this sort of work, but like for Jason's work in men's sheds, I imagine at times it can probably seem sort of overwhelming and like that you can't sort of solve an issue as big as this. But I guess just to kind of boost you a little bit, I think it's safe to say that, you know, you can imagine a world without you doing what you're doing, and the number of sort of men's lives who wouldn't have been sort of positively affected by that. The rites of passage thing is fascinating to me. I mean, Western culture has always been sort of, and I think Jason, I mean, I'm kind of just riffing on what Jason's been saying, but it's always been kind of defined, well, especially modern Western culture, post, you know, Industrial Revolution, has been defined by an absence of the kinds of a lot of formal rituals, and especially, you know, and including sort of male rituals of rites of passage. But interestingly, over the, you know, but in previous sort of eras of this thing called modernity, there were a lot of kind of informal rituals. And Jason pointed to one, you know, a guy's first job, whether it's at the factory or the firm, you know, and the sense that that was a sort of a lifelong, for many, it would have been a kind of lifelong sort of relationship. So even though one of the problems is even those informal rites of passage, for example, that sort of marked kind of Western culture in earlier modern periods, even they're sort of disappearing now for the reasons that we've been talking about. I mean, again, I just think that the work that people like Jason do is just fantastic. And, you know, I think it needs to, you know, yeah, I'm fully supportive of trying to make that more prominent in public discourse, because I don't think it is prominent enough. And I think, yeah, I mean, we didn't talk about this, but I think, you know, I would encourage, you know, I could, you know, I don't want to put myself in too much into this, but you know, I would encourage and be happy to help. I think, you know, getting the work that people like you do and getting opportunities to communicate with, say, you know, women's rights groups and sort of find common ground and sort of realize that I think, and I find this myself, like that I was talking to Jim yesterday about this, that I did a talk recently. I know we've got sort of gone over, but I did a talk recently on this report stuff in another context. And one of the other speakers was a very, if not the most prominent feminist media researcher on these issues of the manosphere and Andrew Tate and so on, more prominent than I am. And I was very a bit anxious about doing this because I was coming in with this position about trying to focus on vulnerability and trying to focus on the things that we've talked about. And I was worried, you know, my sense going into it was that, you know, they're going to think I'm an apologist for bad behavior or whatever. And then I went to one of these sort of post-conference dinners afterwards, and, you know, we got chatting and got along really well. And I was surprised more than maybe I should have been how sort of sympathetic to this perspective and these kinds of views that prominent feminist media scholar was. And also, not just that, you know, her work on this was kind of already moving into, you know, the kind of perspectives that we're talking about. So, I mean, I've circled back to stuff from before, but, you know, I think, you know, I would just like to see the kind of work that Men's Sheds do and Men's Health Forum do, sort of linked to some of these, you know, other groups that might seem to have different interests, but maybe don't, you know.
Yeah, we have worked a lot with women's organisations in the past at the forum, absolutely. Marcus, we're going to leave it there because people are beginning to drop off now because they've obviously got other meetings and stuff to go to. Thanks very much for that. That was really interesting. I think you've raised a whole load of points that we probably should be talking about again in the forum. And it's good to leave on that positive note. I think that men can lead long, healthy, happy lives with good mental health without it making it life worse for women. It's not a zero-sum game, as you know. And I think that's the fundamental difference between organisations like ours and maybe some of the people that we've been talking about today. And that is quite a simple divide to understand. I think whether you see health as a zero-sum game, mental health or whatever. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there because it's 3:05. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Sorry we didn't answer everybody's questions, but we did get to a few of them. and we will try and talk about this again. I enjoyed it anyway. I hope you did too, Marcus.
Yeah, it's an absolute honor, honestly. And I can see some of these nice comments. So yeah, do send through the transcript of this, because I'm really interested to get all of the comments. So yeah, thanks everyone. And yeah, thanks Jim and Martin. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.